Some truths rise not from darkness, but from the weight of stone and steel. Our tale begins where London's pride, the newly built Tower Bridge, casts its shadow over the Thames, and whispers of fraud and betrayal cling as tightly as the morning fog. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour has come to step into the silence beneath the arches. Let us follow the echoes that lead to the heart of the mystery. The river that winds its sombre way through our great metropolis has ever seemed to me a fitting mirror of London itself, sometimes radiant, more often sombre, and most of all inscrutable. On that particular autumn evening, the Thames lay swathed in a dense mist, the outlines of buildings blurred into spectral shapes, while gas lamps burned like pale stars, their light refracted in wavering halos. Above all this murk and gloom, there rose the dark mass of the new Tower Bridge, its Gothic towers standing stark against the veiled heavens. To many it was the proud emblem of our city's progress, a wonder of engineering destined to endure for centuries. Yet, to my eye that night, it loomed like a sentinel guarding some secret of which even London itself was unaware. The fog clung about its iron arms as though reluctant to let them go, and the slow tolling of a distant bell carried a note of foreboding. It is no exaggeration to say that the events which I am about to relate shook both my friend and me to the core, for within the triumph of steel and stone was hidden a human frailty more dangerous than any flaw of design. I had been seated for some hours by the fire at Baker Street, a medical journal resting unread upon my knee, when I became aware of the rare stillness that filled the room. Holmes, in those weeks, had shown an unusual quietude, his violin lying untouched upon the sideboard, his chemical experiments suspended as though his keen energies had withdrawn into some recess of the mind. To me, such inactivity was never a comfort, for when Holmes was restless, life in our shared quarters became at least enlivened by his sparks of deduction, his occasional bursts of irony, and his mercurial shifts from lethargy to brilliance. In his silence, however, the rooms seemed almost too empty, as though awaiting some unseen disturbance. I confess that my own thoughts were not free from melancholy. The autumn mists weighed heavily upon me, and a vague unease, for which I could scarcely account, pressed upon my spirit. It was close upon 11 when my reverie was interrupted by the abrupt knock of the district messenger. The lad, red-cheeked and damp from the fog, handed me a telegram and vanished before I could inquire further. I tore open the flimsy paper and read, "Come at once. Matter of urgency. H. 221B. Though brief, the hand was unmistakable. There was in it none of the idle request or casual curiosity with which Holmes might summon me for some trifling observation. The economy of words bespoke urgency, perhaps even peril. I rose at once, donning my overcoat, and felt that peculiar stirring of anticipation which always accompanies a call into the sphere of Holmes's activities. Whatever languor had lain upon the evening was at once dispelled. When I entered our familiar sitting room a few minutes later, I found Holmes in his accustomed attitude, tall and spare, his figure silhouetted against the window. The street beyond was cloaked in mist, the wavering glow of the lamps scarcely penetrating the gloom. He did not at first turn his head, but I observed the sharp profile, the aquiline nose, and the glint of eyes that caught the dim light with an intensity peculiarly his own. "Ah, Watson," he said at length, his tone carrying that quiet irony which so often heralded some revelation. "I perceive that my summons has roused you from contemplations of a less stirring nature. You must forgive me for cutting short your solitude, but the city does not rest, even when it cloaks itself in fog." There was in his manner that night an undercurrent of anticipation, as though the case before him held not merely the charm of intellect, but the gravity of consequence. Holmes motioned me to a chair and stood for some time in silence, his long fingers steepled before his face. Then, with the measured calm that so often concealed his excitement, he spoke. "Have you considered, Watson, how fragile are the emblems of a nation's pride? A monument rises in stone and iron, a marvel to the eye, yet behind it may lurk the pettiest of intrigues. I fear that such is the fate of the Tower Bridge. He paused, studying me keenly as though to weigh the effect of his words. It is not the structure itself which is in danger, but the honour of those who raised it. I believe that scandal, grave and far-reaching, threatens to attach itself to the name of this latest wonder. If we do not act swiftly, the pride of London may become the subject of ridicule across Europe. His words, delivered with quiet emphasis, struck me with a chill more penetrating than the fog outside. "Come, Watson," said Holmes, rising abruptly. "There is no time for further reflection. We must be upon the ground before our quarry senses pursuit." I had scarcely gathered my hat and stick when he ushered me out into the mist-laden street, where a hansom cab awaited. The driver, evidently prearranged, gave a nod as Holmes directed him. The gaslight fell in wan circles upon the fog, and the horses' hooves rang hollow upon the stones as we were borne away into the night, into mystery, into peril, and into one of the strangest cases it has ever been my lot to share with my friend Sherlock Holmes. It was not long after our return from that nocturnal expedition into the fog that our household was startled by the abrupt clatter of wheels drawing up before the door. The hour was somewhat late for visitors of dignity, yet the sound of a carriage stopping short upon Baker Street had already set Holmes erect in his chair. A moment later, the bell rang with a violence that betrayed impatience or alarm. I crossed to the window in time to see a figure alight. He was a gentleman of middle years, fashionably attired, but his hurried movements betrayed a want of composure. His head darted about in sharp, bird-like motions, and the manner in which he mounted our steps was that of one pressed hard by circumstance. A moment more, and Mrs. Hudson ushered him in with a look of mild curiosity. The stranger paused in our doorway, breathing heavily, as though he had run rather than driven. His gloved hands twitched with nervousness, and the expression upon his face was not that of a man at leisure, but of one who has come to confess a burden. "My dear Watson," said Holmes, with that studied politeness which often veiled his scrutiny, "allow me to present Sir Edward Halberry." The name was familiar even to me, for it was attached to numerous undertakings in finance and industry, and had of late been spoken of in connection with the grand enterprise of the Tower Bridge. Sir Edward inclined his head stiffly, but there was nothing of pride in the gesture. Rather, his face, pale beneath the gaslight, bore the strained look of a man whose prestige sits heavily upon his conscience. He settled uneasily into the chair Holmes indicated, his eyes darting about the room as though fearful of some hidden listener. There was in his manner a curious conflict. The outward appearance of dignity warred with an inward sense of dread. "It is no small humiliation," he began at last, his voice low and husky, "that drives me to seek your counsel, Mr. Holmes. I come to you not as one who desires idle gossip averted, but as a man who sees ruin approaching with swift steps." Holmes inclined his head without a word, his gaze fixed with such intensity upon the speaker that I could see Halberry shift uncomfortably in his chair. "The matter concerns the papers, confidential engineering reports, connected with the financing and construction of Tower Bridge. They have vanished, Mr. Holmes, vanished from the locked safe in which they were secured." The man's hand trembled as he spoke, and he raised it swiftly to his lips as though to steady himself. "If those documents should come to light, they will be twisted into evidence of my own malfeasance. I tell you, sir, their loss would not merely damage my reputation, it would destroy me." His words fell into the silence of the room with a weight that chilled me, for there was no exaggeration in his tone, only the stark despair of one already cornered. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingertips pressed together. "And you have received, perhaps, some communication?" Sir Edward started at the remark, as though Holmes had voiced the very thought he dared not. "Yes," he whispered. "Anonymous letters, veiled threats. They speak of the possibility of restoring what is lost, but only in exchange for certain considerations. The meaning is plain enough." His words trailed away, and he looked helplessly toward us both, as though appealing for sympathy. Holmes's expression, however, betrayed nothing. His eyes alone held that curious glint which I had learned to recognize as the spark of deduction. He neither condemned nor consoled, but allowed the silence to deepen until Sir Edward's agitation grew visibly painful. "Their price, then," Holmes remarked quietly, "is your silence." Sir Edward bowed his head in tacit agreement, his hands clenched upon his knees. With the precision of a surgeon, Holmes began his questions. "At what hour did you last see the papers? Who had access to the safe? What of your clerks, your household, your associates?" Each inquiry struck home with the unrelenting force of a hammer. Sir Edward stammered through his replies, his answers halting and imprecise. More than once he paused to wipe a sheen of perspiration from his brow. I could see, from my vantage point, that Holmes marked every hesitation, every contradiction. His gaze never wavered from Sir Edward's countenance, and there was in it a quiet mastery that seemed to strip the man of his pretense. "Your memory is most curious in its omissions," Holmes observed dryly, after Sir Edward faltered yet again. "It suggests that your anxieties are not solely due to the theft, but to what the theft may reveal." Sir Edward shifted uneasily, his lips tightening as though he had been struck. At length, the financier's composure broke. He leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. Exposure of those papers will not merely show their theft. It will show that I, in moments of desperation, allowed certain speculative ventures to masquerade as secure investments. Should the truth be made public, it would not only bankrupt me, but bring the cry of fraud down upon my name." His words came fast now, almost tumbling over each other, and I could not but pity the man, for pride and terror struggled visibly in him. His fists clenched, his shoulders bent, as though he carried upon them a weight intolerable. For the first time in our interview, there was no effort at concealment. The mask of dignity had slipped, and what remained was the face of a man on the verge of ruin. Holmes remained motionless for a time, his features unreadable. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he spoke. "I shall undertake this case, Sir Edward, but you must be prepared for consequences which may not flatter your reputation. The peril you face is greater than you yet perceive." Sir Edward bowed his head in silence, as though the words carried both relief and dread. Holmes rose, signalling that the interview was at an end. As our visitor departed, his carriage wheels soon lost in the fog, I turned to my friend. But Holmes had already resumed his posture by the fire, his gaze fixed upon the flames with that peculiar abstraction which meant his mind was racing ahead to the unseen battle. The following morning dawned with a clarity that the previous evening's fog had denied us, though a thin veil of mist still lingered above the river. Holmes and I found ourselves once more in a hansom cab, rattling eastward through the awakening streets of London. The pavements, still glistening with dew, bore the hurried tread of clerks and labourers hastening to their duties, while the air was pierced by the shrill cries of costermongers beginning their daily trade. Holmes, seated opposite me, preserved an almost statuesque silence. His keen eyes were half closed, but I knew from long acquaintance that his thoughts were active, marshalling the fragments of last night's revelations into a pattern that only his singular mind could divine. Whenever I ventured a remark upon the weather, the traffic, or our apparent destination, he responded with little more than a nod or an absent murmur. Thus, it was in silence that we proceeded, my curiosity mounting with every turn of the wheels. At length, the cab swung sharply toward the river, and there, breaking through the morning mist like some vast sentinel of iron and stone, rose the newly completed Tower Bridge. Its Gothic turrets soared high, their castellated tops catching what little light filtered through the haze, while its steel arms stretched across the Thames with a power that was almost menacing. I confess that a thrill ran through me at the sight. Here was London's modern triumph, a structure to rival the great monuments of the continent. Yet in that moment I could not shake the sense that the bridge, for all its grandeur, possessed a grim majesty, as though beneath its proud form lay secrets of a darker kind. Holmes, noting my gaze, permitted himself the faintest of smiles. Magnificent, is it not, Watson? And yet, like many monuments of man's ingenuity, it provides as much concealment as display. Let us see what truths lie hidden beneath its noble visage. Holmes insisted that we walk the length of the bridge before venturing within its recesses. The roadway was already alive with movement. Carriages clattered across the planks, carts laden with produce jostled for passage, and crowds of pedestrians streamed in either direction. "Note it well, Watson," Holmes remarked quietly. "Such ceaseless traffic affords a cloak under which many a design may flourish unseen. What better stage for an intrigue than amidst the press of a city that never pauses?" As we moved along, I observed the various faces, the weary labourer, the sharp-eyed clerk, the peddler, and the idler. Each seemed absorbed in his own purpose, yet under Holmes's guidance I perceived the possibility that among them might lurk a watcher, a messenger, or a thief. The thought lent a new edge of suspicion to what had seemed only the ordinary bustle of London life. Having made this circuit, Holmes obtained leave from one of the bridge officials to descend into the chambers beneath the roadway, where the massive bascules and gears were housed. The air there was close and heavy with the scent of oil, the cavernous chambers echoing with the faint metallic hum of machinery at rest. Holmes examined the surfaces with his customary thoroughness, his long fingers brushing lightly across the iron rails and riveted beams. Presently, he stooped to study a patch of dust upon which the clear imprint of a hand could be discerned. The smudge was oddly placed, as though the man who left it had grasped the beam for balance while engaged in some surreptitious act. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "The oil upon these hands was not the residue of honest labour. It has been freshly applied, doubtless to conceal other traces." His eyes moved swiftly across the chamber, fixing upon several more marks that I, until directed, would never have observed. On our return to the upper levels, Holmes paused to question a watchman regarding the routine of their nightly duties. The man, though respectful, seemed puzzled by Holmes's line of inquiry. "There are 4 of us, sir," he explained. "We take our turns regular enough. Only last Tuesday night old Morgan was missing his shift. Illness, they said, though none of us set eyes on him since." Holmes gave no sign of surprise, but I observed a flicker of satisfaction pass over his features. "Illness, you say? And the absence has gone unreported?" The watchman shifted uneasily, muttering something about the man's unreliability, but Holmes dismissed him with a brief nod. As we resumed our walk, he remarked to me in a low tone, "Such lapses, Watson, are rarely innocent. One absent watchman may provide the very window an intruder requires." We had not gone far when Holmes suddenly bent low, beckoning me to his side. Upon the iron flooring near one of the support struts was a line of footprints, faintly marked where dust and oil mingled. "Observe," Holmes whispered. "These prints differ from the ordinary tread of a workman. They are deeper here, shallower there, as though the man carried a shifting weight or paused to examine something of importance." I followed the trail with my eyes, noting how it curved toward the machinery and then vanished abruptly where the surface had been recently swept. There was in it a deliberation that chilled me. It spoke not of chance trespass, but of design. Holmes rose slowly, his keen eyes gleaming. "The bridge itself tells us a tale, Watson, if only we are willing to hear its voice." It was while following this silent testimony that Holmes came to an abrupt halt. Raising his hand, he directed my gaze to the underside of a girder, where, faintly scrawled in chalk, were words half effaced by the damp. The message was brief and cryptic. "The river hides all debts." A curious thrill ran through me at the sight, for the phrase carried an ominous resonance. Was it warning, boast, or threat? Holmes examined the letters with his lens, noting their deliberate formation. "This is no idle scribbling," he observed. "It is the mark of one who wishes his presence known to a particular eye. Such messages, Watson, are both sign and signature." I confess I felt a shiver as I contemplated the unseen hand that had written those words in the shadow of London's proudest monument. We emerged at last into the pale light of afternoon, the mist dispersing into streaks of watery sunlight upon the river. Holmes walked beside me in silence for several minutes, his gaze fixed upon the towers of the bridge that rose behind us. "Steel and stone," he said at length, "are but the outward trappings of civilization. Beneath them lie the designs of men, ambitions, resentments, and secrets more perilous than any flaw of engineering. It is these, Watson, which we must uncover, for it is not the bridge that is threatened, but the honour that attends it." His words left me with a curious heaviness of heart. I felt that the grandeur of the bridge had been subtly altered in my perception, no longer solely a marvel of modern ingenuity, but a stage upon which the darker drama of human intrigue was even now unfolding. It was upon Holmes's insistence that we returned to the bridge at the hour when twilight renders the world both visible and concealed. The gas lamps, newly lit, sent trembling halos into the mist, their glow distorted by the gathering vapours that drifted slowly from the river. The air was heavy with damp, and there was in the atmosphere that peculiar tension which London alone seems to breed, a mingling of industry and secrecy, of countless lives moving yet unseen. We took up our position upon the pedestrian walk, Holmes standing with the air of a man to whom patience is but another form of action. His tall frame, wrapped in his long overcoat, blended almost into the gloom, while I, with less assurance, found my gaze constantly drawn to the shadows shifting upon the roadway. As the evening deepened, the noises of the city seemed to recede, leaving only the sluggish lap of the Thames against its embankments. From where we stood, I could glimpse the black surface of the water, broken now and then by a wavering reflection of lamplight. It appeared to me a restless, unwholesome thing, at once alive and impenetrable. Holmes, however, kept his eyes fixed not upon the water, but upon the darker recesses of the bridge itself, where girders cast long bars of shadow across the stone. His profile was sharp in the dim glow, his expression that of a hawk poised for flight. I marvelled, not for the first time, at the intensity of that concentration, which could convert a night's vigil into an act of purpose. It was while I mused thus that Holmes's hand tightened upon my arm. Following his gaze, I perceived at the far end of the bridge a solitary figure emerging from the mist. He was cloaked in a garment of dark green, the hood drawn low so that his features were obscured. Yet there was in his gait a deliberate caution, as though each step were weighed against the risk of discovery. The man paused once, turning slightly as though to scan the roadway behind him, before proceeding toward the centre of the bridge. His movements were measured, his posture tense, betraying a purpose which no casual passer-by would assume. The sight of him set my heart quickening, for instinct told me that here was the very actor in the drama we had come to observe. The figure reached a spot midway along the bridge, and there halted. With a glance around, he drew from beneath his cloak a small bundle, carefully secured with twine. Producing a length of rope, he leaned over the parapet and lowered the parcel toward the water below. Out of the gloom there slid a boat, its oars muffled, its occupant scarcely discernible. The boatman raised his hands silently, and the bundle descended into his grasp. The entire operation was conducted with such precision, such utter absence of sound, that it struck me as uncanny, like some secret ritual enacted between shadows. Holmes's eyes gleamed, though he made no sound. I felt the blood beat in my temples as the bundle changed hands, for I knew that within lay the secret which had brought Sir Edward Halberry to our door in despair. At the instant the boatman pulled back upon his oars, Holmes gave me the briefest signal and moved swiftly forward. The man in the green cloak started violently, sensing rather than seeing our presence. With a sudden turn, he abandoned the parapet and fled along the bridge, his figure swallowed almost at once by the billows of fog that had thickened with the fall of night. I followed as best I could, the echo of our footsteps ringing hollowly against the stone, yet the mist closed around us like a living wall. Ahead, I caught the brief flutter of his cloak then lost it in the swirling vapour. Holmes pressed forward without hesitation, his figure a shadow among shadows, while I struggled to keep him in sight. The pursuit was brief, yet bewildering. The fugitive's footfalls quickened, echoing across the empty roadway, then faltered, then ceased altogether. We pressed on, searching, but at each turn the fog mocked us with silence. There was no figure to be found, no sound save our own breath and the distant creak of the bridge. Holmes stopped abruptly, his keen gaze darting from parapet to pavement, from lamplight to shadow. Yet after a long moment, he straightened with a frown. "Gone, Watson," he murmured, as though the mist itself had swallowed him. I felt a chill at his words, for indeed the night seemed to have closed over the man, leaving us only the emptiness of his passing. Holmes, however, was not one to leave a field barren of evidence. With a sudden stoop, he retrieved from the paving a scrap of paper, crumpled and half-trodden into the damp surface. He examined it briefly, then passed it into my hand. By the faint light of the nearest lamp, I discerned it to be a fragment of a shipping invoice, the ink blurred but legible in part. A name, incomplete, and a dock number stood out among the smears, tantalizing in their promise, yet frustrating in their incompleteness. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "The fog has robbed us of our quarry, Watson, but it has left us a whisper of his purpose. Let us see where this shred of paper will lead." It was early the following afternoon when the peace of Baker Street was rudely disturbed. Without so much as a knock or an announcement, the door burst open and in strode Inspector Lestrade, his hat thrust back upon his head and his narrow frame vibrating with self-importance. I confess I felt a spark of irritation at his abrupt intrusion, for Holmes and I had been engaged in quiet discussion, and the inspector's manner carried more noise than courtesy. Holmes, however, greeted him with that peculiar amusement which he often reserved for the official police. A slight curve of the lips, a glance at me from beneath half-closed lids, and I knew he was already entertained by the contrast between Lestrade's bustling energy and his own composed detachment. "My word, Mr. Holmes," cried Lestrade, rubbing his hands together with relish. "The case is as clear as day. Stolen papers, missing watchmen, and smuggling gangs swarming along the docks. It all fits as neatly as a glove." He proceeded to outline his theory with great confidence. According to him, a band of petty criminals, well known for pilfering cargo from river barges, had extended their enterprise to include the theft of valuable documents. The bridge, so near to the Thames, had merely offered them an opportunity to climb, conceal themselves, and make their escape by boat. As he spoke, his voice rose in triumph, as though the matter were already concluded. I could not but marvel at his certainty, for the evidence he presented seemed to me a patchwork of conjecture stitched with overzealous haste. Throughout Lestrade's spirited recital, Holmes reclined in his chair with an air of studied languor. From time to time he interjected a quiet remark, so dry that I could not discern whether it was agreement or irony. Indeed, most ingenious. "Quite so, the docks do breed many a knave." Yes, yes, cargo and confidence alike disappear there. Each phrase served only to fuel Lestrade's enthusiasm, while leaving me in a state of some perplexity. Was Holmes conceding the inspector's case, or was he merely toying with him as a cat toys with a bird? The glint in his eye suggested the latter, though his lips betrayed nothing. At last, Lestrade concluded with a flourish. "I have already arranged for a raid upon several dockside taverns. By week's end, we shall have half a dozen rogues in custody, and I dare say one of them will sing of stolen papers soon enough." He adjusted his cuffs with satisfaction, clearly expecting Holmes' approval. My friend, however, merely inclined his head with the faintest of smiles. "Your energy does you credit, Inspector. I should not dream of interfering with your arrangements." With that, Lestrade bustled out as abruptly as he had come, leaving behind the faint odour of damp wool and the echo of his confidence. When the door had closed behind him, Holmes allowed himself a soft chuckle. "Zeal, my dear Watson, is a commendable quality. but in excess, it is apt to serve as a blindfold. He moved to the window and stood gazing out at the drifting smoke of Baker Street, his hands clasped behind his back. Our good inspector pursues his quarry in the taverns of the dockside, while the true mischief walks among us unobserved. There is no finer cloak for a crime than the clamour of official certainty. I could not deny the justice of his words, though I marvelled at his composure in allowing Lestrade to pursue what he so clearly considered a false trail. Turning back into the room, Holmes seated himself once more and leaned toward me with sudden gravity. "Mark me well, Watson. The marks we observed beneath the bridge were not the haphazard traces of some drunken sailor or idle thief. They were the careful signs of one acquainted with the machinery itself. The absent watchman, the precise smudges upon the gears, the cryptic message upon the girder. These are not the tools of dock thieves." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "No, my friend. The hand that stole those papers is guided not by chance, but by knowledge. It is the deliberate hand of one who has moved daily among the workings of the bridge, who understands its rhythms and its secrets. Such a man does not stumble upon opportunity, he creates it." The weight of his words pressed upon me with renewed force. The matter had grown more sinister, for it pointed not to nameless rogues of the waterfront, but to some figure within the very circle of trust surrounding London's proudest monument. The rain, which had threatened since dawn, began to fall in earnest as Holmes and I made our way eastward once more, our cab jolting through narrow streets that glistened beneath the gas lamps. My companion sat forward, his sharp profile etched against the damp window, while I, less certain of our errand, was content to follow his lead in silence. At length, the vehicle drew up before a sombre row of offices near the river, the brass plate upon one door bearing the name of Mr. Alwyn Mercer, architect. Holmes alighted with brisk decision, and motioning me to follow, mounted the steps. "You will find our host a man of talent, Watson," he observed, "but perhaps also a man of wounds, some self-inflicted, others bestowed. Let us see which have left the deeper scar." Mr. Alwyn Mercer received us in a chamber as austere as its master. Tall and gaunt, with a stoop that spoke less of age than of perpetual strain, he rose from his drafting table with evident reluctance. His cheeks were hollow, his lips compressed, and his hands, which he rubbed together nervously, betrayed a ceaseless unrest. But it was in the eyes that the true story lay. Restless, quick, darting from object to object, as though pride and resentment waged a constant battle behind them. At times they shone with the light of accomplishment, at others with the dull fire of suppressed anger. I felt at once that here was a man who had given much to his work, and received in return only bitterness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, bowing slightly. His voice was measured, his words chosen with care, yet beneath the courtesy there ran a note of tension. He bade us be seated and inquired after the object of our visit. When Holmes mentioned the name of Sir Edward Halberry, however, the mask slipped for an instant. Mercer's lips tightened, and a flash of something akin to scorn crossed his face before he recovered himself. "Sir Edward is well, I trust?" he asked, with an air that was polite in form, yet edged with hostility. Holmes's reply was bland, but I could not fail to notice how carefully he watched Mercer's every gesture, as though that fleeting expression had told him more than words could ever do. With the quiet assurance of one accustomed to extracting truths from unwilling lips, Holmes began his inquiries. He asked after the progress of the bridge's construction, the difficulties encountered, the adjustments made to satisfy the financiers. Each question was delivered in a tone so mild that it seemed conversational, yet I could see Mercer bristle under the scrutiny. When Holmes touched upon the subject of the project's accounts, Mercer hesitated before replying, his hands clenching upon the arm of his chair. At another question, whether all technical drafts remained in his possession, his eyes shifted, and the answer came too quickly. Holmes noted each pause and falter with the calm precision of a surgeon examining a wound, offering no rebuke, only the unyielding persistence of his gaze. At last, Mercer's composure gave way. Do you think, Mr. Holmes, that a man may dedicate years of his life to a vision, only to see it bartered away by financiers who care for nothing but profit? His voice rose as he spoke, his gaunt features working with passion. They forced compromises, cheapened materials, curtailed designs. I was told to obey, to bow before the purse strings of Sir Edward and his kind. The bridge stands, yes, but it is not the bridge I dreamed. It is theirs, a monument to commerce, not to art, and they dare speak of honour while they betray all that honour means. His words ended in a harsh laugh, and for a moment the bitterness in him seemed to fill the room. Holmes alone remained unmoved, his hands folded, his gaze intent. As Mercer's voice subsided, I found my eyes drawn to the man's hands. They trembled, though he clasped them tightly to still their movement. A sheen of sweat stood upon his brow, and his gaze flickered constantly between us and the scattered drafts upon his table. There was guilt in that shifting glance, though whether for his resentments or for something darker I could not yet say. It seemed to me that Mercer bore within him a secret too heavy to be long concealed. His thin shoulders hunched as though beneath an invisible burden, and every word he spoke carried the strain of a man balancing on the edge of disclosure. Holmes, after a pause of calculated indifference, requested to see the architectural drafts. With visible reluctance, Mercer spread them across the table, long rolls of parchment covered in intricate lines and annotations. Holmes bent over them with an absorption that was not wholly feigned. He traced the outlines with a delicate finger, murmuring occasional commendations. Yet I observed that his attention was not confined to the drawings themselves, but to certain sheets set apart, half hidden beneath others. With a deft movement he drew one forth, its markings unlike the rest. The paper was covered not with designs of girders or towers, but with symbols arranged in deliberate sequence, circles, slashes, and curious marks that bore no relation to engineering. Holmes examined the page with evident interest, his face betraying nothing save a faint narrowing of the eyes. He slipped the sheet quietly among his own notes as Mercer turned to adjust a lamp. When the architect faced us again, Holmes was speaking smoothly of minor technicalities, as though nothing unusual had occurred. It was only when we had taken our leave and stepped once more into the rain-slicked street that Holmes allowed himself a remark. Holding the sheet to the lamplight, he said in a tone of quiet triumph, "You observed, Watson, that these markings bear no resemblance to structural notation. They are a cipher, a message concealed in the guise of drafts, and where there is cipher, there is conspiracy." The words struck me with a shiver, for I understood then that our case had shifted from the realm of fraud and bitterness into one of darker and more deliberate intrigue. It was near the stroke of midnight when Holmes and I took our position beneath the immense towers of Tower Bridge. The night was damp, the mist clinging to every surface, and the stones about us exuded the chill of the river. We placed ourselves within a recess, concealed from casual glance yet commanding a view of the roadway and the parapet above. Holmes, immobile as a carved statue, seemed insensible to the clammy air. For my own part, I confessed to a growing discomfort, not only from the cold, but from the weight of suspense that hung over the scene. There is no silence so oppressive as that of a great city at rest, its usual tumult subdued into an expectant hush. Beneath us, the Thames lay like a ribbon of black glass, disturbed only by the slow lap of the current against the embankment. No craft moved upon its surface, no voice carried from the far banks. It seemed to me more a presence than a river, something ancient and watchful that bore in its depths the secrets of 1,000 forgotten crimes. I shivered as I gazed upon it, for its silence was uncanny. It appeared to swallow sound, to absorb the faintest echo of movement. In that stillness, I felt acutely how exposed we were, how every stir of foot upon stone might betray us. Holmes, however, never shifted his gaze, his whole being concentrated upon some point invisible to me. The stillness was not to last. Presently, I thought I detected a flicker upon the water, a shadow that glided and was gone. My heart quickened, and I leaned forward. but Holmes's hand pressed lightly upon my sleeve. "Remain still, Watson," he whispered. "There are movements afoot, but we must observe before we act." Peering through the mist, I caught again the fleeting shapes, vague and uncertain, as they crossed the path of the moonlight that filtered between clouds. They might have been no more than tricks of the eye, yet something in their stealth convinced me they were real, agents in the drama which Holmes had foreseen. My nerves sharpened, straining to pierce the fog. It was then that a cloaked figure appeared from the shadow of one of the arches. He moved with the careful tread of one who both knows his way and dreads discovery. Reaching a spot midway along the bridge, he produced a small lantern, which he shielded with his cloak, allowing but the faintest glimmer to shine. He raised it thrice, pausing between signals. Almost at once there came an answer, a boat gliding noiselessly from beneath the span, its oars muffled, its single occupant a dark shape hunched at the stern. The two conspirators moved with a precision that spoke of rehearsed familiarity. Watching, I felt an unease creep upon me, for here was the very heart of the intrigue laid bare before our eyes. The man upon the bridge drew from within his cloak a packet of papers bound with cord. Securing it to the rope, he lowered it carefully down toward the boat. The boatman extended his hands, steady as stone, to receive the prize. At that instant, Holmes sprang forward. "Hold!" he cried, his voice ringing out sharp and commanding. In one stride, he reached the parapet, his hand upon the rope. The conspirators, startled by his sudden presence, froze for a heartbeat in astonishment. I too rushed forward, my pulse hammering with the peril of the moment. But surprise was brief. The man on the bridge uttered a curse and, in a flash of movement, wrenched the bundle free, flinging the rope aside. Holmes grasped at it, yet the cloak was already sweeping past him. With desperate speed, the cloaked figure darted away, his footsteps ringing upon the stone as he vanished into the adjoining street. Holmes, never one to abandon pursuit, followed without hesitation, his tall form cutting swiftly through the mist. I hastened after them, though the night air struck my lungs like ice and the ground seemed treacherous beneath my feet. The fugitive plunged into the labyrinth of warehouses and narrow alleys that bordered the docks. The echoes of his boots ricocheted off the walls, mingling with our own as we gave chase. Yet the maze was his ally, and more than once the sound seemed to spring from every side, leaving us uncertain of the direction. For several frantic minutes we pressed on, turning corner after corner, the mist rolling thick through the passageways. Once I thought I glimpsed the flutter of his cloak ahead, but when we reached the spot, there was nothing but shadows and silence. The echo of footsteps had ceased, swallowed by the night. Holmes at last drew to a halt, his breath unlaboured despite the pace. He stood listening, every nerve alert, but the only sounds were the mournful wind from the river and the distant moan of a foghorn. "Gone," he said at length, his voice cold with frustration. "The city has hidden him as surely as if it were his accomplice. Yet he has left traces enough, Watson. The game is not ended." With that assurance, we retraced our steps toward the bridge, our minds heavy with both defeat and determination. We returned to Baker Street in the small hours, weary from our fruitless pursuit through the maze of warehouses. The night's damp clung to my coat, and my limbs ached with fatigue. Yet Holmes walked beside me with his customary erectness, betraying no outward sign of defeat. His silence was profound, though it bore the peculiar quality I had learned to recognize. Not despondency, but the concentration of a mind revolving ceaselessly upon some problem. As I lit the lamp within our sitting room, he seated himself in his armchair, fingers pressed together, his eyes fixed upon the fire. Not a word escaped him as I shed my outer garments. I knew better than to intrude upon that silence. For my friend, failure was but a pause before the next move, and his stillness was the stillness of calculation, not surrender. The following morning, Holmes dispatched a note, and before noon our visitor of earlier days once more crossed the threshold of 221B. Sir Edward Halberry's appearance had altered. He seemed diminished, his step hesitant, his face pale and drawn as though he had passed a sleepless night. His eyes, once restless with pride, now held a hunted look, betraying the torment of a man who dreads exposure. He bowed stiffly, scarcely meeting our gaze as he accepted a seat. His gloved hands trembled upon his lap, and his lips pressed together as if to hold back words he feared to utter. Holmes, standing by the mantel, regarded him with an expression of grave composure. "Sir Edward," he said, "we have reached a point at which candour is no longer optional." Holmes drew from his pocket the fragment of the torn invoice and the sheet he had removed from Mercer's drafts. Spreading them upon the table, he spoke with quiet deliberation. "This scrap," he said, pointing to the smudged paper, "places the conspiracy at a particular dock. This cipher, cleverly disguised as an architectural notation, was penned by Mercer, whose bitterness you know too well, and together they form a chain of evidence not against him alone, but against you." He turned his eyes upon the financier with sudden intensity. The theft was no random stroke of dockside villains. It was a deliberate act, born of knowledge and grievance. A grievance, Sir Edward, that would not exist had your dealings in the matter of the bridge been as honourable as they were profitable. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by Sir Edward's laboured breathing. At length, Sir Edward lifted his head, his voice low and faltering. "I will not insult your intelligence, Mr. Holmes, nor yours, Dr. Watson, by denial. Yes, I engaged in ventures which were not what they appeared. In my desperation to maintain credit, I permitted figures to be altered, securities to be represented as more solid than they were. Had the bridge collapsed, all would have been ruin. But it did not. It stands, and with it my fortune, such as remains." His words came haltingly, as though each syllable cost him dear. "The papers you speak of, if revealed, would strip me of all I possess. Mercer discovered enough to suspect, and in his righteous indignation he has chosen to punish me." He covered his face with his hands, the proud baronet, now but a man shamed and trembling before us. Holmes regarded him without pity, his tone calm yet edged with steel. Indeed, Mercer was no common thief. His was the anger of the craftsman whose work has been profaned. To him, the bridge was a monument of art, sullied by compromise and deceit. He struck not for money alone, but for vengeance, to expose you, to show the world that beneath the noble towers lies corruption. His bitterness was fueled by discovery, not by envy. Had your dealings been honest, Sir Edward, Mercer would have had no weapon to wield against you. The financier groaned and muttered something inaudible, his head bowed upon his chest. I felt a pang of sympathy despite his guilt, for Holmes's words cut deep, sparing no illusion. Holmes rose, and for a long moment he stood gazing down at Sir Edward, his lean figure framed by the light from the window. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of judgment. "You built a bridge of iron, Sir Edward," he said slowly, "but upon foundations of sand. You deceived others, and in so doing, deceived yourself. That which was meant to span a river has become a monument to vanity, not honour, and now the tide of truth rises beneath it." The financier raised his eyes with a look of despair that I shall not soon forget. The words, delivered without passion yet with implacable certainty, seemed to strip him bare of all pretence. He made no reply, but his trembling hands betrayed the storm within. Holmes turned to me then, his features impassive. "There, Watson, lies the true peril, not in the strength of girders or the sweep of steel, but in the weakness of the men who command them." The hour was barely past 5 when Holmes and I found ourselves once more at Tower Bridge. A grey dawn crept over the city, cold and colourless, the mist of the river rising in pale wreaths about the massive stone arches. Few souls stirred at that early hour, and the silence seemed deeper for the vastness of the structure towering above us. Holmes, calm and collected, led me to a recess near the base of one of the towers. From there we could observe without ourselves being seen. The chill air bit through my coat, and the stones beneath my boots felt as cold as the river itself. Holmes, however, appeared unmoved by the discomfort. his keen eyes fixed upon the roadway with the patience of one who knew the exact hour when his quarry must appear. Presently there came the clang of signal bells, followed by the slow, ponderous groan of machinery awakening to life. I watched with awe as the great bascules of the bridge, those colossal arms of steel, began their solemn ascent to admit the day's first river traffic. The sound reverberated like the voice of some ancient giant, echoing across the waters and sending shivers through the mist. Beneath, a steamer moved slowly upstream, its funnel belching a trail of smoke that mingled with the fog. The creak and strain of the bridge seemed to me an apt prelude to the confrontation that Holmes had foretold, as though the very fabric of London groaned in sympathy with the secrets about to be laid bare. It was as the bascules settled once more into place that Holmes touched my arm lightly. "There, Watson," he whispered. Following his gaze, I saw Alwyn Mercer emerge from the shadow of the tower. The architect's tall, gaunt figure was unmistakable, though this morning he moved with anxious haste, his head bent, his shoulders hunched as though warding off more than the chill. Under his arm he carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, which he clutched with the desperation of a man guarding both treasure and doom. I felt my heart quicken. Here, in the pale dawn, the bitterness we had glimpsed in his office now revealed itself in desperate action. Holmes's face was unreadable, his eyes coldly intent upon every movement of the man below. Mercer descended toward the machinery chambers, where the great gears still hummed with the effort of the bridge's raising. There, near a side passage half concealed by iron struts, waited a solitary messenger, a fellow of rough appearance with cap pulled low. The man glanced about nervously, then extended his hand in silent expectation. Mercer paused, breathing heavily, then drew forth the bundle from beneath his arm. With trembling fingers, he began to untie the wrappings, exposing the edges of thick papers within. I saw his lips move as though he muttered to himself, his gaunt frame quivering with mingled anger and dread. The messenger leaned closer, his hand outstretched, ready to seize what was offered. It was at this precise instant that Holmes stepped forward. He moved without haste, yet with such inevitability that both men started as if confronted by a phantom. His voice, calm and cutting, carried across the chamber. "That will suffice, Mr. Mercer. The bridge was not built for such transactions." Mercer wheeled round, his face ashen, the bundle still clutched in his hands. For a moment he seemed rooted to the spot, the enormity of his exposure dawning upon him. The messenger shrank back into the shadows, and with a muttered curse vanished into the labyrinth of passages, leaving Mercer alone to face his accuser. There was a long silence, broken only by the drip of water from the girders and the distant cry of gulls above the river. Then Mercer spoke, his voice low but fierce, trembling with passion. "Yes, Holmes, it is as you think. I took the papers. I sought to lay bare Sir Edward's corruption, to show the world how greed had fouled the work to which I gave my soul. He stole from me my design, my vision, my honour. Why should I not strike back?" His hollow cheeks flushed with sudden fervour. I meant not merely to expose him, but to ruin him, to make him feel in his fortune the very wounds he inflicted upon my pride. I knew it was treachery, yes, but treachery against a man who betrayed his trust and mocked my toil. His words echoed against the stone, filled with the desperate eloquence of a man who confessed not from remorse, but from a need to justify his vengeance. Holmes listened unmoved, his lean figure erect, his eyes like steel. When Mercer at last fell silent, breathing hard, Holmes spoke with chilling calm. "You have condemned yourself with your own tongue, Mr. Mercer. You speak of honour, yet you betrayed it. Sir Edward defiled his position through avarice, but you, in your bitterness, became his mirror. Between you, you have turned a monument of skill into a stage for deceit. The law will weigh your crimes, and it will find neither man without blame." Mercer's shoulders sagged. The fire left his eyes, replaced by a weary resignation. I felt the weight of Holmes's words press upon the chamber, like a judgment handed down from the very stones of the bridge. In that grey dawn, it seemed to me that ambition and pride had made both men, the financier and the architects of their own ruin. The dawn had fully broken by the time we quitted Tower Bridge, the grey pallor of morning spreading in thin veils across the Thames. The mist that had cloaked the river through the night now dispersed into languid ribbons, drifting slowly above the water's surface. Barges and steamers moved sluggishly upon the tide, their funnels issuing smoke that mingled with the pale air. Holmes and I walked side by side in silence. The chill of the vigil still clung to me, yet it was not merely cold that pressed upon my spirit. The events of that night, the attempted delivery, Mercer's confession, and Holmes's stern rebuke lay heavy on my mind. Though the city stirred anew about us, I felt that we had emerged not merely from darkness into dawn, but from one layer of truth into another, deeper shadow. As we crossed into quieter streets, my thoughts dwelt upon the strange symmetry of the case. Two men, so different in station, one an eminent financier, the other a visionary architect, stood alike, disgraced. Sir Edward, undone by avarice; Mercer, consumed by bitterness. Their downfall had not been wrought by one another alone, but by the flaws each carried within himself. I could not help but muse upon the nature of justice. The law would seize Mercer, no doubt, and mete out its punishment. Sir Edward, however, though spared a jail, would suffer the slower, more merciless penalty of public contempt and private remorse. Thus the scales were balanced, not evenly, perhaps, but in that inscrutable fashion by which human folly punishes itself. My companion gave no voice to these reflections. He strode with hands clasped behind his back, his head bent forward, his steps measured with mechanical regularity. His profile, cut sharply against the wan haze of morning, bore the austere composure of a man absorbed in thought. More than once, I was tempted to address him, yet something in his manner restrained me. Holmes's silences were never empty. They were the crucibles in which his judgments were formed. To interrupt him was to scatter. The sparks before the flame had caught. I walked on, therefore, content to let him shape his conclusions in the solitude of his own mind. At length my restraint broke, and I ventured a remark. "Do you think, Holmes, that Sir Edward may recover from this ruin? Men of influence have survived scandals before." Holmes's lips curved in a faint, sardonic smile. "Reputation, Watson, is like glass. Once fractured, it may be patched, but the flaw remains. Sir Edward may yet walk among his peers, may even retain a semblance of dignity, but he will never again command the trust he has squandered. His wealth may be salvaged. His honour is beyond repair." The words, delivered in Holmes's even tone, fell with the finality of a verdict. I felt a pang of pity for the man, yet could not dispute the justice of the conclusion. We had reached the embankment, where the towers of the bridge rose once more before us, outlined against the thinning mist. Holmes halted, his gaze fixed upon them with an expression curiously mingled of admiration and severity. "Observe it, Watson," he said at length, "a marvel of engineering, stone and steel interlocked in perfect symmetry, a monument that shall outlast the men who conceived it. Yet within its strength lies weakness, not of matter, but of motive. For all its grandeur, the bridge is no purer than those whose hands shaped its destiny. Beneath the noblest structure may lurk the frailty of human hearts." The words struck me with peculiar force, for I saw at once the truth of them. The towers seemed to rise not merely as symbols of progress, but as reminders that pride and corruption can dwell even within monuments of strength. Holmes stood silent for a moment longer, his keen eyes upon the river, the mist curling about the arches below. Then he turned to me, his voice grave and deliberate. "Stone and steel may span a river, Watson, but only truth can span a man's soul. Strip away truth, and no weight of iron, no height of tower, can bridge the gulf within. That is the lesson our financiers and architects alike must learn, though too often they learn it when it is too late." I made no reply. The solemn cadence of his words lingered with me as we turned once more toward Baker Street. And though the city quickened about us, I carried with me a silence of my own, the silence born not of mystery, but of reflection upon the frailty of men and upon the steadfastness of the one friend whose pursuit of truth was itself a bridge across every shadow. Holmes and I walked in silence for some time, the river's mist curling about the arches of the bridge we had so recently quitted. At last he spoke, his voice grave yet steady. "Consider it, Watson. Men build monuments of stone and steel, believing them to be enduring. Yet the true measure of endurance lies not in girders, but in the truth which supports them. Remove that, and even the mightiest structure crumbles. And now I turn to you. What do you think? Was Mercer's greatest error his betrayal of trust, or his belief that vengeance could restore his honor? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this mystery, I invite you to comment, subscribe, and share it with others who delight in the strange and the shadowed paths of Sherlock Holmes.